So there was an organizing effort in Bessemer, Alabama, at the Amazon facility, and they had been working on this for quite a while. It became a big national news story. Bernie Sanders, of course, was fighting to try to help them in their union effort. Even Joe Biden came out and had some words of encouragement and said, to the executives and the people at the top of the company, hey, you better keep a hands-off approach here and you better not pressure people. So this was huge. And there are huge, gigantic consequences, reverberating effects if there was a successful unionization effort in Alabama at the Amazon facility, because then other Amazon facilities will, be emboldened and think like, let's do that here, So this was big. They had the vote. Unfortunately, the union failed. So let me give you some information on this. This is from BBC. They say, Amazon has defeated activists hoping to establish the company's first unionized warehouse in the U.S. Workers at the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse voted 1,798 to 738 against the effort, labor officials said. That represented a majority of votes cast in the contest, which was seen as a key test for Amazon after global criticism of its treatment of workers during the pandemic. The union said it would challenge the results. It accused Amazon of interfering with the right of employees to vote in a free and fair election, including by lying to staff about the implications of the vote in mandatory meetings and pushing the Postal Service to install a mailbox on company grounds in an effort to monitor the vote. Quote, Amazon has left no stone unturned in its effort to gaslight its own employees, said Stuart Applebaum, president of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, RWDSU, which organized the effort. We won't let Amazon's lies, deception, and illegal activities go unchallenged, which is why we are formally filing charges against all of the egregious and blatantly illegal actions taken by Amazon during the union vote. So, they're not wrong. There was a giant effort on social media where Amazon pays for these bot accounts and troll accounts to defend Amazon, and these accounts would be created with like 4 followers, and they'd be tweeting about how, boy, I sure do love my Amazon factory job, and it sure is great that I have management bark orders at me and I don't have a union. Isn't this wonderful? So they do this propaganda effort. The other thing is they try to make the case as aggressively as they possibly can that no, what a union does is just an added layer of bureaucracy, and they take their union dues from you, so they take money from you, and they're not even able to deliver on their promises of creating a better work environment. And the thing with the mailbox they just alluded to here, there's been, a number of specific stories of people leading union efforts where there's retaliation against them. And technically that's illegal, but they get away with it. But you have, the companies effectively get away with it. So, listen, call it what it is. This was an overwhelming defeat. But the interesting thing is, Crystal Ball did a great radar on this, and she outlined that she was predicting that this thing was going to fail. And she did it beforehand, and she said beforehand, this is not any indictment on whether or not unions help workers. On the contrary, we know they help workers. This is a lot of people who are probably terrified and afraid that they're going to lose their job if they support the union. And so they just feel like, let me play it safe and not rock the boat because I don't want to lose my job. And she was correct. Crystal Ball predicted this. And it's a shame that this is where we are, but this is where we are. And when you see the results here, you're reminded why we need something like the PRO Act. The PRO Act is a phenomenal piece of union legislation, and if implemented, it might end up being more crucial and important than even the $15 minimum wage, because that has, wide-ranging effects for workers. It effectively, the PRO Act, among other things, bans right-to-work laws, so-called right-to-work laws, which is really right to work for less. When you look at countries that have near universal collective bargaining, what you see is just phenomenal conditions for workers where they have more time off, better benefits, phenomenal pay. I mean, in some Scandinavian countries, they have near universal collective bargaining, and they don't even have like minimum wage laws because what would be the effective minimum wage is like $30 or $40 an hour, because that's what the union does, is they fight for, better pay, better benefits, more time off. And what we see here is Amazon, it has a pretty terrible record. Now, Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna effectively forced them to pay a $15 minimum wage, which is fantastic. But COVID really showed just how terrible they are, because they didn't have the proper safety rules and protocols in place, and people were getting sick. And then, of course, there was this story that Ken Klippenstein broke about how drivers are pissing on the road and in bottles and shitting in bags, and they do this because there's implied pressure and threats that you need to get all your deliveries done, and if you don't get all your deliveries done within a certain time window, then there's going to be consequences. You might get fired. And so Amazon desperately need a union, and unfortunately it was voted down, and it was voted down decisively. Now, a lot of that, yes, you can pawn off to veiled threats, sketchy practices, illegal practices from management, but you also can't pawn it all off to that. I want to be honest about the shortcomings here. And when you read on in the article, it becomes very clear. One of the strategies of the organizers were to tie the union effort into the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was a thing that they really leaned into. They talked about racial issues tied to the unionization effort. And they have quotes from workers. And by the way, it's like about 80% or something like that, black warehouse. And they have quotes from some of these workers in some of these articles. And they're basically like, don't do that. Like, why are we talking about the Black Lives Matter movement? Because there's, again, 80% or so black workers at this warehouse. And a lot of them are like, I'm not necessarily down with everything in the Black Lives Matter movement. Why? And they felt like it was a little bit of an apple and oranges. Like, why are you trying to tie that into what we're doing here? And the people were effectively like, hey, man, I just want to pay my bills. And I just want to, have healthcare. And I don't know why you're bringing all this extra stuff into the conversation. That was the sentiment. That was the sentiment. So I think there was actually a giant strategic error on the part of the organizers to try to link in the Black Lives Matter movement, because even at an 80% plus black factory, there's a lot of disagreement on the Black Lives Matter movement and their perception of the movement. And they don't know why that's coming into the conversation involving their job. When a lot of them said, hey, I didn't feel like race was an issue at all in my employment here. So I don't know why we're talking about that. So the argument wasn't made directly enough and clearly enough that when it comes to the unionization effort, what this is really about is making sure there's COVID safety protocols so you don't die on the job, making sure you have increased pay, you have paid vacation time, you have better benefits. It wasn't clear to them that, for example, one of my favorite facts about unions is that in the so-called right-to-work states, the workers make, I think it's about $1,200 or $1,300 on average less. And in the union states, workers make over $1,000 more per year, and they have better vacation time, better benefits. That argument wasn't made clearly enough to people. The argument wasn't made clearly enough to people that when you look at U.S. history, what was called the golden age of economic expansion, the post-World War II period, one of the things that led us to have a thriving middle class in this country is high unionization rates, and that there was a direct correlation between, the health of the working class and unionization rates. And as unionization rates declined, the middle class declined. These arguments were not made explicitly enough. And so I think there was a strategic error on the part of the organizers where they leaned too much into race, because you have black workers telling you, I don't know why we're talking about this. Oh, I just want to pay the bills. And so I do think that was a failure on their part. But again, you can't say enough about the way in which management implies threats. They have veiled threats, and they pull out all the stops and all the tricks to get people to vote against their own best interest. So here we are. This is the result. And my reaction to this is that I've never seen a better argument for the PRO Act. I've never seen a better argument for something like card check. I've never seen a better argument for why we need to change the default setting in the country, And the Republicans and management has done a superb job of flipping the conversation and turning it into a choice thing, You should have the choice to determine whether or not you're in a union. And that's a really disingenuous way of talking about it, because it's like saying, I'm going to give you the choice of making less and having worse benefits. That's really what the question is. That's really what they're proposing. But they lie about it, and they act like, well, if you join a union, you're actually just going to pay them a portion of your paycheck, and they're not going to deliver on anything. So really, the unions are like oppressive. But that's just a lie based on the numbers, based on the data, based on what we know about how these things function. So there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of anti-union propaganda. And by the way, that's another thing that the PRO Act bans. There would be, management wouldn't be allowed to do their bullshit anti-union propaganda if the PRO Act passes. So it's a real shame. I'm sad by the result, but also, if you're somebody who's on the left, setbacks really shouldn't impact your commitment to fighting. If anything, the opposite of what you think should happen is what should happen. So in other words, after you have a defeat, okay, redouble your efforts. Don't tuck your tail between your legs and go home sad. You got to redouble your efforts, because nobody's coming to save us but us. And so this is what you have to do. And I'm sad that it failed, but we move on and we keep fighting, and hopefully eventually we'll get to a point where we have unions, and the unionization rate across the country is a lot higher, and then the working situation will be much better for people all across this country.